and welcome to the special edition of Book Club, the 50th book reading one. And today we are happy to have Pallavi here with us. Before that, we have our monthly greetings to the birthday people. We have 4 of them. We have Vicky, Saga, Nidhi, and Zareen. The ladies are here. Happy birthday, and I request Nidhi and Zareen to have a few words with us.
Happy birthday, both
Happy
of you.
birthday.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Zareen. Happy birthday, Nidhi.
Thank you, guys.
Go ahead. Say a few words if you like.
No.
Happy
that's-
birthday.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Looking forward to this session. Really looking forward to listening to Pallavi speak and Pico speak. Thanks for arranging it, Milind and Yanks, as usual. Lovely to be part of this book club. Always great to hear what people have to say.
Thank you, Nidhi. How about
Nidhi?
Zareen?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank
Hello.
you so much for the advance wishes. It's my first birthday wishes. Thanks to you all. Mine is at the month end, so it's a little time away. And like Nidhi says, really excited to hear today's session, especially with the guest speakers that we have. And the initial conversation with Pallavi was very interesting. So looking forward to hearing more from her. Thank you very much to both Milind and Eranki for arranging this session. And all the best to everyone. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks, Zareen. Happy birthday. And now we'll move on with the session. And as is our practice, we'll have one curtain raiser. And this time we slightly departed from our original curtain raisers, and we said how Indians have been interacting the global scenario through the most exported commodity, our movies.
உலகம் 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 அழகு கலைகளின் சுரங்கம் பருவச் சிலைகளின் அரங்கம் காலமே ஓடிவா காதலே தேடிவா मेरा जूता है जापानी ये पतलून इंग्लिस्तानी सर पे लाल टोपी रूसी फिर भी दिल है हिंदुस्तानी मेरा जूता है जापानी ये पतलून इंग्लिस्तानी सर पे लाल टोपी रूसी फिर भी दिल है हिंदुस्तानी मेरा जूता है जापानी
देखी है सारी दुनिया जापान से लेके रशिया ऑस्ट्रेलिया से लेके अमेरिका देखा है प्यार का सपना दिल चाहे कोई अपना मिल जाएंगे एक साथिया एक देसिया मेरे इंडिया एक दिल चाहिए बस मेरे इंडिया
So that's our interaction, but I think we have better people today to listen to.
That was
Lovely.
beautiful, Srinivas. Thank you. So, really a special day for all of us today to be celebrating the presence of Indians globally with Pallavi Iyer in person with us. And that's delightful. And Pico Iyer will be joining subsequently. We also have Rajiv Lochan, a peripatetic, art-loving Indian, and his wife Yuriko-san joining us. So please join me in extending a warm IIMC Book Club welcome to all of them. More about each of them when we hear them being introduced by those among us who took the lead in inviting them here today. Equally
Milind,
so,
Milind, I'd like to just interrupt. I sent you a message. Unfortunately, Rajiv is he's been having a cold for a long time, and it's been diagnosed as a kind of a ear infection.
oh, no
So he's not
problem.
able to hear properly, So he was really
Okay.
looking forward to attending this
Okay.
session.
Okay.
So yeah, so maybe we'll have to have it
That's
another
okay.
time. Maybe we could have
That's
him
okay.
especially.
Sure.
So he was
Sure.
hoping to the last minute to be able to join, but then today morning he said it's very uncomfortable and he can't really hear at all.
No problem. Thank you for letting
So
us know.
apologies for that to everyone. Yeah.
Not at all. Equally so, we are also celebrating all of us in the book club as global Indians. We are based in the US, Canada, the UAE, India, and Australia, spread out all the way from San Francisco to Sydney, who have participated in 50 monthly sessions, reading at least 50 engaging and rewarding books. Today, we primarily read Orienting and Indian in Japan, written by Pallavi. So before turning the podium over to her, let me ask Gautam to briefly introduce our guest speaker. So go ahead, Gautam.
Sure. Thanks, Milind. And good afternoon, guys. It's my pleasure to introduce Pallavi Iyer here today. Personally, my introduction to Pallavi is as the daughter of one of my earliest colleagues in the Taj in 1982, Gitanjali Iyer.
Actually, oh my God. Okay.
Sadly, she is no longer with us, Ishan, as you know.
Yes.
But many of us will remember her as a popular Doordarshan newscaster in the early 80s and late 70s.
Very much, very much.
Swapi and I also have an association with her father, Swaminathan Iyer, in Grass Academy, the skills education entity that we promoted almost 20 years ago. But coming to Pallavi, so much can be said of her accomplishments. Award-winning foreign correspondent and author, she spent over 2 decades reporting from China, Europe, Indonesia, Japan for various publications, the New York Times, Sunday Telegraph, and in India, the Hindu, the Indian Express, Mint, and the Wire, and of course, several others. She is the author of 8 books, debuting with Smoke and Mirrors in 2008 on the different political and social systems in China and India. Her latest, what we've read now, Orienting an Indian in Japan, 2021, analyzes the cultural and aesthetic values that underpin Japan, triangulating her conclusions with comparisons to India and to China. Then there is Punjabi Parmesan, Dispatches from a Europe in Crisis, Chinese Whiskers and Jakarta Tales, which is the adventures of soybean and tofu, and Choked in 2017 on the air pollution crisis in New Delhi and in Beijing. She has, of course, presented her work at literary festivals around the world, including our own JLT. Awards and accolades. Selected by the World Economic Forum 2014 as a young global leader. In 2007, she was awarded the Prem Bhatia Memorial Prize for Excellence in Political Reporting for her dispatches from China. And interestingly, in 2010, she was recognized by China's Premier, Wen Jiabao, for her work in furthering Sino-Indian relations. Since August 2022, she teaches an elective titled Global Media, Local Lenses, and runs workshops on cross-cultural communication and creative writing at the IE University in Madrid. Her education itself took her all over the world. Philosophy at our St. Stephen's in 1996, modern history at Oxford, global media and communications at LSE and at the University of Southern California in 2002. With Orienting, Pallavi discusses the Japanese way of life. And I thought her insights were astonishing, hugely interesting. She notes the Japanese people's normalization of civic behavior to explain their stress on time and punctuality, why they clean up after a football game, why Japan sees such low rates of crime, and the high possibility that your lost items will be found and returned to you. The negative side, she says, could be suppression of spontaneity. I look forward very much to learn more insights today. With that, thank you, Pallavi, for joining us today. A bunch of not so young that graduated IIM Calcutta in 1981. We are delighted and we are honored. Over to Milind.
Thank you so much, Gautam, for that very comprehensive introduction of our guest. And with that, Pallavi, let's hand the microphone over to you, even if virtually so.
Okay. So first off, thanks a lot, Gautam, firstly for tracking me down through the connection with my mother and through a couple of other intermediaries. Thank you for persisting and for inviting me to speak with all of you. Thank you, Milind, for all your work over the last couple of months, following up and ensuring that despite our geographical spread, we were able to find a time where all these different time zones could be accommodated. And I'm extremely grateful and really looking forward to the conversation that we'll have going forward today. I just wanted to make sure that you were aware that I now have about 45 minutes left because I basically had an hour and we've taken up about 15 minutes. And the reason being that my brother is visiting from the United States and he's about to arrive in half an hour at the house. And I also realize that many of you have read the book, and so I don't want to waste too much time sort of going over ground that you might already have read on the book. But in this sort of set of slides I have some nice photographs, and maybe we can quickly go through those. And then I think it would be lovely if the bulk of the time that I have could be spent in like a Q&A format and just answering any questions you might have, not only about Japan, but about being a sort of global Indian, about the creative process and writing, or anything else that you might want to talk about. So does that sound good?
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much.
We're on to the first slide over here. I also wanted to say that Pico Iyer, who you'll be hearing from later, and I are no relatives despite sharing a surname. People often mistake us for cousins or something like that, but no, it's just a coincidence that we have the same surname and an interest in Japan. But as I wrote in the book, and as was evident from the introduction, I have spent a lot of time over the last 25 years, well, since my whole life actually, living in different parts of Asia. So of course, being from India, but then 7 years in China and 4 years in Indonesia, and then eventually 4 years in Japan. But before I moved to Japan, I realized that although I had considered myself to be a bit of an Asianist, you know, with the India, China, Indonesia triangle, in fact, there was something that was missing, a critical piece that was missing from let us call it the Asian jigsaw puzzle. And that critical piece that was missing was Japan. And Japan was in many ways an anomaly, quite different from the other Asian countries that I knew, because the other ones, you know, had this kind of upward thrust of people and commerce, and Delhi and Beijing and Jakarta were noisy, chaotic megalopoli. And, you know, their trajectories were rising. And then suddenly you had Japan and all its exceptions exceptionalism because firstly, its geographic location, which is right on the edge of the map, actually served as a kind of metaphor for its separateness from the rest of Asia. And it was rich and it was quiet and it was old demographically and punctual, and it was rule obsessed as opposed to being loophole hungry like all these other Asian nations. So my learning curve was very steep, particularly in the initial months, because it was not like any other place that I had known. And I also wanted to just talk a little bit about that whole experience of being somewhere new and how it feels like in the initial months, because I've now moved countries 8 times over the last 20 years. And I have to say that there's something very special about the first year that you spend in a new place, because that is that one period of time when the ordinary, the quotidian is not invisible. It becomes visible. Most of us, we get so used to our surroundings that we stop actually looking at it with any wonder or curiosity. But when you are new to somewhere, you kind of bring that outsider perspective in, and many things that are lost to the inhabitants themselves or to long-term residents because they've become so accustomed to seeing what they see are different. And I love that initial period of being somewhere because I feel like the word to see really applies. You see with your eyes, you drink in with all your senses, you look at the body language of people, whether they lean towards each other or not. You notice the titles of books that they might be reading on the metro. You look at the signs and you try and figure them out. You look at the ground and you notice the manhole covers. There's a lot that sort of comes alive when you bring your outsider perspective to a new place in the initial months. And of course, the same was the true for me when it came to Japan. And I think that the things that initially really leapt out were things that already were referred to Gautam a little bit. One was that it was very, very safe. And the other was that it was kind of unnaturally clean. And I think particularly coming from a kind of Jakarta / New Delhi perspective. But in the slide, we see this little child, right? And I remember that on my second day in Tokyo, I saw a little kid of about 6 heaving this kind of school bag, wandering alone down a busy Tokyo road. And my instinct was to run after him to ask if I could help to find his parents, because I just assumed that he was lost. But before I could catch up, he pulled out a metro card from his pocket and disappeared into the bowels of the Tokyo subway system, which is one of the busiest subway systems in the world. And so it took me months really to become inured to the sight, which was unthinkable in almost every other big city I'd lived in, New Delhi or London or LA or Jakarta, of elementary age school children hopping onto buses and changing trains and subway stations, on their way to school. But in Japan, this was completely unremarkable. It's a journey that they began making from grade 1 when they were 6 years old. And the training, I realized, for this began when they were quite young in kindergarten, and they were encouraged to observe their older siblings going about on their own. Parents showed them how to safely cross roads when they were about 4, and also pointed out safe spots for if there was ever any trouble, particularly natural disasters, because as we know, Japan is also prone to earthquakes. So you can imagine you have your 6-year-old out there in Tokyo and suddenly an earthquake strikes. What are they supposed to do? Can we turn the slide, please? This is where they go. They go to the convenience stores. And, there's 55,000 of these, in particular, 7-Eleven and Family Marts around Japan. They say that there are more convenience stores than Shinto temples in Japan. And you'll rarely go 500 meters anywhere without bumping into one. And these have been designated as safe spaces for all school children. So if you are a school child in trouble, that's where you head in, and it is the responsibility of the convenience store person to contact your parents or allow you to stay in there and give you safe shelter until they can contact you. So, the question, of course, always was like, how has this miracle been achieved? Because, coming from Delhi and Bombay and many of these cities, parents don't let their children out of their sight. They're so worried about their safety and security. So how are these little children at 6 wandering around on their own in what is one of the biggest cities in the world, a city of 30 million people? Another way of putting that is, how have these kind of village-like levels of trust been achieved in such a complex urban environment? Because you can imagine this happening in a small village where everybody knows everybody, but how does it happen in somewhere like Japan? And I mean, firstly, of course, crime in Japan is very low. Something like, I think only 900 murders were reported in 2019, 2020, and the population is about 130 million people. So it's an extremely low violent crime rate. Can we change the slide, please? The second thing is also excellent public infrastructure, right? Trains, we all know, are like almost preternaturally on time in a place like Japan. And one of my favorite anecdotes was about an incident in 2017 when there was an express train between Tokyo and Tsukuba, which left the station 5 seconds early. And the train company had to actually publish an apology, and the story made it to the newspapers because there were people who arrived and apparently did not manage to catch their train because it had left 5 seconds early, which is, almost detail, I think, for many other parts of the world, that this would even be an issue. But I think the most crucial ingredient in this whole recipe that allowed Japanese children such independence was an accepted reliance on community. And the fact that even though it's this huge megalopolis, it kind of acted in many ways as organic community, allowing for very high degrees of public trust. Retirees often volunteer to usher children across roads when they are crossing them in the morning. Little kids, the first year kids wear like a yellow patch on their school uniform so that people are aware that this is their first year out and about on their own and might lend them a hand if they get stuck. And ultimately, I let my own kids travel alone in Beijing, even though in Tokyo, even though my younger one was 7 years old and my older one was 10 years old, and they used to take the bus and travel all around Tokyo on their own, something that they had to stop doing when we moved to Madrid. And I remember them finding that quite difficult. Can we turn the slide, please? Yes, this was just the other point, which again, Gautam had brought up, which really strikes you when you arrive, about the how everything that you end up losing is almost inevitably found. This is me with my wallet, with lots of money and all my credit cards that I recovered a day after having lost it, simply by going to a little police station around the road and reporting it. And they made a few phone calls. It had been found and turned in, and I was able to recover it 15 minutes later. And as the slide says, that across Japan, there's an 87.5% chance of finding lost money. So this is not just umbrellas or lunch boxes, but hard cash that is turned in all the time. So I guess the question is, what accounts for this, right? Do the Japanese just have morally superior DNA? Does eating a lot of sushi make them a better person? Is this the cultural influence of Zen Buddhism? I mean, these are all things one thinks about. But I think eventually I came to the conclusion that it's simple, that trust breeds trust, and that good deeds encourage good deeds. And if someone has taken the trouble of turning in your wallet to the police, the next time you find somebody's wallet, you are more likely to turn it into the police because you've experienced that good deed being done to you. So, as Gautam had summarized, it's the normalization of civic behavior. And I think it's really this normalization that accounts for this village-like level of public faith in what is an urban jungle. Plus education, because from a very young age, the Japanese have a kind of hierarchy of values drilled into them in school and at home. And a major message that is constantly being transmitted is that The comfort and the needs of other people are at least on par, if not above your own, which is why, for example, people are discouraged from talking loudly in public transport or in general, because the idea is that you will infringe on the oral space of others. It might disturb other people. And it's why Japanese football fans so famously clean up after themselves, and even others in a big football game internationally. It's something that always makes the news in countries like Spain. Can we change the slide, please? So here you'll see about how cleaning is actually part of the school curriculum. So all from kindergarten onwards, children clean their own classrooms. They clean public areas of the schools. They clean once or twice a year. They have like cleaning day, and people go outside and clean. The children go outside and clean the neighborhoods. So, you know, all my Japanese friends, grown-up friends, said that they firstly never saw cleaning as something degrading or dirty, and it was just so important for, I mean, it was just something that they considered to do, that they had to do every day, clean their house and clean around them, and take a kind of personal responsibility for public spaces as well, because they had to take personal responsibility for the public spaces in their school from the time that they were in kindergarten. Can we change the slide? Now, the issue that I kind of point out is that you do end up having two sides, yeah, of this coin, because while you'll have safety, social trust, punctuality, and cleanliness, the opposite side is that when you have this enormous amount of safety, there's a lack of spontaneity. There can be xenophobia. So, for example, a lot of Japanese are very anti-immigration. And the reason they are anti-immigration is because they say that people who come from outside will not share our history. They will not share our culture. They will not have been acculturated, for example, into this kind of cleanliness from when they are in school. So when they see the behavior of tourists littering, you know, that kind of gets reinforced. There's a very strong idea that, you know, Japanese are somehow unique in their culture, and that foreigners would dilute that. And the reason that they can have that culture is because they are homogenous and do not have immigrants, like has been the case in many other parts of the world. The other side of the coin is also mental health, because if you are always putting so much emphasis on others and not being a burden to others, often the individual gets lost. And in Japan, we have high rates of suicide. We have stigma attached to mental health. So there are mental health problems. And of course, just generally suppression of individuality, right? Which means possibly that, you know, sometimes innovation can be difficult. So I just wanted to point that out, because it's not as though I'm, you know, here just saying, oh my God, the Japanese are unique and amazing. There are always trade-offs when you kind of come to any society. Certain social characteristics are prominent, but then they'll also have another side to the coin. Can we change the slide, please? This is just the story of Japanese curry, which was something that I referred to in the book. And it's always such an interesting story, because if you ask the average person in India or outside Japan, what is Japan's national dish, I think that they will likely say sushi, maybe soba, something like that. But in fact, in Japan, curry is possibly the most popular dish. And the Japanese Navy has a curry Friday every Friday. And school children, it's served in school lunches. And, you know, so curry is ubiquitous in Japan. Of course, it's a bit different from curry in India. It tends to be mixed in with wheat flour, so it's more glutinous, and it's often sweet because they add honey to it. And I discovered the history of the dish really dates to the 1870s, when naval officers of the British Royal Navy picked up the curry habit from India and passed it on to their Japanese colleagues. So the earliest recipes for raisu curry, as curry and rice is known in Japanese, came from British cookbooks, like Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management. And that's why they have all these weird ingredients for an Indian, like sour apples and flour and things like that. And in Japan, in fact, the dish comes from Britain, not from India, in their head. So they classify it as Western food. if you go to like a Western restaurant, you know how in India we have these continental restaurants, and when we go to these continental restaurants, they have like vol-au-vents or mushroom stroganoff or whatever. We have chicken Kiev, some dishes from old-fashioned continental restaurants in the 1980s. Japan's old-fashioned Western restaurants always had curry and rice, which I thought was interesting. But there is one restaurant in Tokyo that has historically prided in serving itself authentic Indian curry. Can we change the slide, please? Here we are, and this story actually relates to an Indian from Bengal called Rash Bihari Bose. So he's more famous in Japan than Subhash Chandra Bose. We call him the other Bose, but he's very well known in Japan. He was born in 1886, and in 1912 he was a nationalist and ended up becoming involved in an assassination attempt of the Viceroy of India, Lord Hardinge, and he then had to flee India to escape the British authorities. And he ended up pretending to be a relative of Rabindranath Tagore and stowed away on a boat and arrived in Kobe in Japan. And the reason is that Tagore was actually supposed to visit Japan. So he claimed that he was a relative who was coming on a kind of recce. And he ended up being taken in by many right-wing Japanese nationalists who were also anti-colonial. And because he had been involved in this assassination attempt against the Japanese, he became involved with all these right-wing Japanese who were essentially anti-white colonialists, and was introduced to a family called Toyama who were bakers. They were a family of bakers in Tokyo, and he married their daughter and lived there, and ultimately introduced his version of curry to that family, and that family is called Nakamuraya, and they still have a restaurant in Shinjuku, one of the busiest areas of Tokyo, where they serve that curry. Okay, the next slide, please. Yeah, and this is just an example of how curry is seen as Western food. And so you can see that they actually serve it in a sauce boat. So they'll have chicken curry in a kind of sauce boat, which you would use for gravy to put on top of roast lamb or whatever. And then they just give you a plate of rice like that. So that's how curry rice was originally and continues to be served in Tokyo. Next slide, please. Yeah, this was just Rabindranath Tagore's speech when he went, and I love it because I feel like it sort of summarized my feelings of when I wrote Orienting, because, when you write about another country, it's a huge exercise in hubris because you're a foreigner, you know nothing. I mean, even people from a country always have a partial vision, and to then write about it and explain it in some ways is an undertaking that is, it is inherently hubristic. But I think, Tagore said it well when he said, "My stay here has been so short that one may think I have not earned the right to speak to you about anything concerning your country. I feel sure that I shall be told that I am idealizing certain aspects while leaving others unnoticed." And I just, also wholeheartedly feel that about myself. So just wanted to appropriate his quote to explain how I too feel about my writings, not only on Japan, but China, Europe, any foreign country, indeed about India as well. Can we, yeah. And very quickly, just wanted to say about how, India and Japan are such a good fit on paper. So that whenever you have politicians on both sides, they always talk about the fact that they don't have any historical conflict, that they in fact have a lot of affinity and cultural connections because of Buddhism, and they have complementary economies in the sense that India has a demographic surplus and Japan has a demographic deficit, and India needs investment in infrastructure, and Japan has money to invest, and so on and so forth. They look like they're a great fit. However, in concrete terms, there's not that much real business that happens on the ground. India does far more business with China. Japan does far, far more business with China. And in fact, whenever you have Japanese companies in India, it's not a good fit. They find it difficult. And I try to explain why in the next slide. I call it the Jugaad Shokunin dichotomy. Jugaad, all of you are very familiar with, and Jugaad is anathema in Japan. Japan is very much about the Shokunin culture, which is also an extreme kind of culture of perfectionism, never good enough. It has to be perfect, perfect, perfect. And when you have the kind of perfectionism running up against the, the Jugaad culture, it makes for a difficult fit, a very difficult fit when neither side understands each other very well. Can we move forward? So Jugaad, finding loopholes, improvisation, focus on the good enough. Next one. We read Pico Iyer already. So yeah, we can just leave it at that. Let me see. I have some notes in case I have anything else I want to add to that. Yeah, just this deep cultural dissonance, the Jugaad Shokunin dichotomy. The Shokunin spirit is embodied in, for example, the sushi chef apprentice who has to train for 10 years before being allowed to cut the fish. Or the sake brewer who at night dreams of yeast because he is so involved in his profession. The shokunin is always aware that perfection is inevitably elusive, but regardless must never be given up on. So for example, Hokusai, who's this very famous woodblock painter, he is the maker, for example, of the Great Wave of Kanazawa. He was the epitome of a shokunin. On his deathbed, he was almost 90 years old. And when they said, are you any last words? He said that if only heaven had given me another 10 years, maybe even 5 years, I could have become a real painter. And, he had huge success in his lifetime. So this is the shokunin spirit, that it never stops. And I spoke to this guy called Nishizawa, who was the manager of JETRO, which is the Overseas Investment Association of Japan's research department in Tokyo. And he had spent 5 years in India. In the office of JETRO between 2011 and 2015. And he basically said that it took Japanese companies in India much longer than their Korean or Chinese counterparts to learn how to, say, for example, localize their products for the Indian market. And he had given me the example of air conditioners, saying that, they were like fixated on the quality of the air conditioner so that they could last forever without need for repairs. But in India, it was cheap to have an air conditioner repaired and technicians were available, and the consumer was more focused on cost than durability, more on cost than perfection. In other words, more on jugaad than on shokunin. And that kind of, just was a practical example, I think, of how that jugaad shokunin mentality difference makes it difficult sometimes for Japan and India to come closer together economically, despite it being a very good fit on paper. So I'll leave my sort of bhashan at this point. We still have 20 minutes, and I would love to have a freewheeling interaction and take any questions, comments, anything.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating virtual visit to Japan, Pallavi. And after reading your book, even then, this was refreshing to learn so much from you. I'm sure all of us have a lot of questions. Let me start with a quick one and then let others ask you questions. You've been very fortunate in not only being in Japan for so many years, but in China, in Europe, in Indonesia, the last country that I've been to many, many years ago. But apart from the comparison between Japan and India, what do you see as values in these other countries that we could easily imbibe, either in the
India
US
could
or in
imbibe.
India? Yeah, either US or India.
So each of these are different, right? So, I mean, I would say different set from China, different set from Indonesia, different set from Japan. China for me is very interesting because when I talk about the jugaad shokunin dichotomy, and I say that at some level, India needs to be less jugaad and sort of more towards the shokunin, and Japan needs to be less shokunin and a little bit more towards the jugaad, like with greater flexibility. And I feel like that's China. In some ways, we both need to come closer towards China, which exhibits traits of both. There is this kind of loophole finding and flexibility, but at the same time, there is also less of a tolerance of shoddy work. I mean, and it's more process oriented and methodical than India is. So, I mean, I certainly think that is something that India could learn from China. Indonesia, it has a lot. You know, it is unlike like, Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim democracy. 80% of their population identifies as Muslim, and 20% is either Hindu or Christian or Buddhist. They recognize 5 different religions. So it is also a huge and sprawling country with a big population, not comparable to India's, but 275 million people. And it's a very relatively new democracy. And so I think the ways in which it has dealt with pluralism, which it has its own problems, but without running into the kind of majoritarian hatred of minorities to the extent that we have in India, despite it being a Muslim majority population. And in India, often there's the stereotype that Muslims are intolerant, and, you know, in a Muslim country, you will have much less tolerance. In fact, I think Indonesia is an example of a Muslim country that has shown greater tolerance towards its minorities than we might have in India. Linguistically, I think also all of these countries are interesting. I don't have a final take on it, but I see, like, I always look at India, China, and Indonesia as 3 very different examples of how we went about shaping our modern linguistic landscapes, because we were all essentially coming out as new modern countries in the 1940s, right? And deciding what shape our new republics were going to take. And China chose Putonghua, the language of Beijing, the language of the center, as being Chinese. And local languages exist, but everybody had to learn Chinese, and they developed the language of the center as the national language. India went for 22 different languages, and this kind of linguistic federalism, because it said that we could not have a single national language given the complexity of our linguistic makeup. What I'm trying to show is that China also had the complexity of linguistic makeup, but it chose the kind of centralizing version. Indonesia was the most interesting case because it also had complete linguistic diversity, and the majority language and language of power was Javanese, that came from the island of Java, where Jakarta is. And the nationalists decided not to use Javanese simply because if they made Javanese the official language, it would then make all the other smaller languages worried and maybe reject Javanese as the official language. And so they engineered a minority language, which was Bahasa Indonesia, which is Malaysian basically, which was Malay. And Malay had been used as a lingua franca for trading communities. And they made that into their national language, not Javanese. And now every single person in Indonesia, 99% of the population speaks Bahasa Indonesia. It's been one of the most successful engineerings of a national language possible. So it's very interesting to kind of see these different language trajectories of big, large, complex, pluralistic countries. So, you know, it's always dangerous to say that you should learn this way because everybody has their own histories and limitations. So you can't sort of whole-scale copy from another country, but certainly there's a lot of food for thought when you start looking at other countries, and especially ones similar to India in terms of colonial histories, complexity of ethnic and religious and linguistic landscapes.
Great. That was very interesting to know how they dealt with languages in so many different ways in different countries. So with that, let me ask Ishan, who's raised his hand, to ask another question.
Actually, two quick questions, both Japan related, Pallavi. One is Shinto and Buddhist. Do they coexist easily in Japan? Because one is like, you know, it could be Mayan, could be Vedic. I mean, you know, if you look at Shintoism and Buddhism, ultimately has some norms, you know. So I was just trying to understand, because it's almost 50-50. So how do they exist?
Can I just answer that first, and then maybe we'll take your second question? They coexist extremely well, and there's a kind of division of labor between them, which I find fascinating, which is that Buddhism is for death and Shintoism is for birth and marriage.
Lovely.
Okay, so yeah, so people get married according to Shinto rituals, but funerary rites are Buddhist. Okay, and they both exist well because unlike the religions of the book, unlike the Abrahamic religions, are not very prescriptive, and in fact, they're not very theistic. There's no kind of omniscient God out there that's saying, do this, don't do that. They're kind of philosophies and, about ways of life and ethics and suffering. And then they prescribe certain rituals. And basically, Japan has picked different rituals with birth and marriage. Marriage can also sometimes be Christian, even though they are not Christians at all, but many of them get married in a church, which has nothing to do with their religion. So Japan is a fascinating country because actually, if you speak to most Japanese, they say they are not religious. So I think 70% of Japanese are described as atheists. However, they will take the rituals on. And so they will almost always have Buddhist rituals for death and Shinto rituals for birth and a mixture of Shinto and Christian for marriage. So I think it just shows a fascinating flexibility, which you often see in Asia, in Asian countries or countries which don't have this kind of religion of the book, which is Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, the Abrahamic religions. It's much more porous and flexible.
My second question before Milind stops me, which is innovation. I mean, I've always found prescriptive societies to be low on innovation. And Japan has always fascinated me as a very prescriptive society in terms of ways of behaving, norms, etc., but still manages innovation. And
it has not managed innovation for a while, though, Ishan. So I think a lot of us are kind of stuck in our idea of the 1980s when there was this idea that Japan was going to take over and the Walkman was like so cool and Sony and all of that. But I mean, if you go to Japan today, you will see exactly the consequences of what you are talking about. They've not been able to innovate. They are hugely anachronistic. It's very much stuck in the 1980s, like Walkmans and neon are what passes as high tech still. And you go to China is where you'll see the high tech. And in Japan, you can't even you don't even have like these UPI payments or whatever. Cash is still king. It really feels stuck 40 years ago. And I think part of it is this prescriptive society. So I think they somehow caught a moment in the 80s where there was that innovation, but it could not be sustained because it tends to have these kind of sclerotic systems and it cannot reverse course very easily.
Thank you.
Yes, Arvind, go ahead.
Yeah. So you spoke about these Muslim majority countries which get along pretty well with other religions. Well, even other than Indonesia, the Central Asian countries, Uzbekistan and the other stans, in fact, they have almost 95% Muslim majority, and they're actually also very good at managing other religions, and they don't have the xenophobia. So there are a lot of countries like that.
Interesting. Yeah, absolutely. Very interesting.
Nidhi, go ahead. You've raised your hand.
Yeah, very illuminating and interesting talk, Pallavi. Loved it. Especially your comment about China sort of taking on the best of both India and Japan in a way. But my question was, how do the Japanese let off steam? All that.
Get drunk.
That's hit
the izakayas, the taverns.
Yeah. Do both the men and the women, both men and women do that, or is it just the men?
So it's more men. It is still a very patriarchal culture, and this drinking, it's amazing. This Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde behavior because they're so straight-laced and like physically buttoned up in the sense that when a salary man goes to office, they are literally buttoned up. So it's literal, And then in the evening, it's very much part of the culture that the boss will insist that his whole team goes drinking, and not just drinking, but getting shit-faced, like till they pass out. I have seen, and then people are like, another kind of human being. They're talking loudly, all this being quiet and respecting others and all goes out of the window. And you can see that it's this need to kind of blow off steam. With women, it's less, but also I think women are less, despite it being a very patriarchal culture, because women are not in the salaryman framework. They don't have that kind of level of being buttoned whole. Women have other outlets. They have their friends, they have their children, they can walk. I mean, I would much rather be a Japanese woman than a Japanese man. So I've written about this because many people always say that, oh my God, women in Japan are so oppressed. And Indians say this to me, and I find that kind of hilarious because I'm like, please look at women in India. Okay? Don't look at women in Japan to feel so bad for them. Okay, but because because we read the New York Times and, we get this kind of view that amongst the OECD countries, women in Japan form less of the workforce. And there is a glass ceiling and so on and so forth. So there is definitely more of a division of labor. But what it means is that, women are more at home. But being more at home versus being a salary man in an office, I don't know which is worse. Like I said, women have other avenues to blow off steam. Men lead such a constrained life in, getting dressed, going to office. Often they have to sleep there because they have to be available at all hours of the time, weekends included. It can be a very, very difficult life, and they do not have the emotional vocabulary to talk to friends and things either, whereas women often do. So I think that getting drunk is really a very male thing because that is essentially their avenue.
I just
Rama?
wondered, oh, sorry. It was
Rama,
a
go
follow-up,
ahead.
Milind.
Let Rama ask his
Sure,
question and we'll
sure,
come back
sure.
to you. Yes, Rama.
I found your perspective on Japan, of course, very fascinating like others. And my question really relates to the manga and anime comics. And can you comment about the genesis and why that's so strong and how that is getting exported all over the place? Because it's so
I mean, the
unique.
thing is that, I'm not a manga and anime person. So it is one thing that's actually missing from my book. And a lot of people have pointed that out because it's so influential. And for a lot of young people around the world, it's huge, right? It's part of Japan's soft culture. It's part of this otaku culture, which is essentially geeky and inward looking. And it's about teenage boys in their room, not interacting with other human beings as much as interacting on the screen and living out all these fantasies. And it seems to be part of the zeitgeist. We see that happening around the world with teenage boys. And so I think, in this moment, it's particularly good. There's also a lot of skill involved because, the actual inking and the graphics behind it are incredible. So there are also people who are very attracted to it because it's like a developed art form, right? So it's a kind of niche developed art form. But I think you take that and then you translate that into a world which is more and more interacting with screens, and where a lot of fantasies are being lived out on screens, and you kind of get some understanding of its global popularity as well.
Thank you, Pallavi. I see 3 hands raised, so let me take it in the sequence I see. Sangeeta, go first.
Hi, Pallavi. Thank you for that wonderful talk and a wonderful book, which I found quite like a page turner. And I love the hashtag 2 weeks in Japan. And my 2 weeks are coming up soon, so I'm looking forward to that.
You'll come back transformed.
I'm not yet transformed. My question was about your writing process. So, for taking the example of this book that we're talking about today, did you have that in mind as an agenda, or did that motivation to write this book sort of spun organically? So, just wanted to understand that a little bit.
No, I have a writing process, and I mean, it's 100% necessary because I've lived in, like I said, 8 countries in the last 20 years and brought up 2 children. So I don't have the privilege of, just going off to writing retreats and like not coming back until I've written the book or whatever. I've had to do it in the midst of all of these other things. And I've also had a day job, either as a reporter or as a professor throughout this time as well. And my door is open, and so the writing has really happened in the punctuations and the gaps and the commas and the semicolons of the rest of daily life. And in order for that to happen, I think you need a combination of discipline, and I mean, it's basically discipline. And so I tend to carve out mornings for writing, which is the quietest times for me, in the sense that children are in school, and I also tend to my brain works well, and anything that's creative, first thing in the morning is better when my brain is fresh. So I tend to write 2 or 3 hours every morning, and that's it. Afternoons will often be other kinds of work. So editing, reading, research, teaching. Whenever I have teaching, I always do it in the afternoons. Grading, socializing or anything like that tends to be in the afternoon. And I sort of fiercely protect, I don't know, say 9 to 12 or 9 to 1 as my writing time. And I just show up at my desk pretty much like if I was going to office. It's not optional. It's not like, oh, I'll watch Netflix instead, so unless I'm like seriously ill or something, I'm at my desk. And even on bad days, I try and write something. So fully aware that not every day is going to be as productive because it's not that kind of job. You will write better because you'll be inspired better on some days than other days. But it is like a job in that you can't just wait for the spirit to seize you because then you could be waiting forever. So yeah, I think you kind of have to show up at your desk and then just out of boredom, at some point you'll start writing. I think if you can be at your desk and say, I'm not going to do anything else for the next hour, I don't have to write, but there's nothing else I can do, you will find that you will start writing simply because you're bored. So it's always a good trick.
Great. Thank you. Zareen, go ahead.
I'm afraid I just have 5 minutes more, okay?
Yes.
Really sorry. Okay, so I'll make it a quick one, Pallavi. Actually, it was very intriguing to read your slide on the dichotomy in Japanese culture. At one side, there's perfection, which people like us from India would really admire. And the other side, you said there is a high rate of mental health and suicide. So you find that similar in a place like Finland, where it's supposed to be the happiest country in the world, but suicide rates are still high. So I wanted to just understand your view as to why this dichotomy happens.
I think it's the parameter. Yeah. So for the happiness index, I think it's the parameters that they use for happiness index. They rarely ask people, are you happy? They ask things like, do you think that school is good? And the Finns will say, yes, school is good. Do you think that your child will have a secure job? And they'll say, yes. So the parameters that they use are often ones that sort of skew to those kinds of answers, whereas an Indonesian might not give those answers. They might say school is horrible and no, I don't know about my children's future. But they might actually be happier people in terms of being content with their life and less prone to mental health. So part of it is the questions, the way, the parameters on which they base happiness indexes, which I think are not always transparent, right? So, I mean, in the case of Finland. But for Japan, I mean, it's essentially, I think, linked. Any quest for perfection will lead to a lot of anxiety and you'll never be satisfied, right? So you never reach a point where you say it's enough. In Japan, it's never perfect. So there's always this much more you could be doing. And hence the story of Hokusai, who was on his deathbed saying, is there anything else you want to say? And instead of saying, I've had a great life and I'm so grateful, he was like, I wish I could have 10 more years so I could become a better painter. So, if you are always striving for perfection, anxiety is the bedfellow of that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pallavi. Anjali, quick question, and then Saida and Sharath. Go ahead.
Pallavi, very quickly, I've been fascinated by the fact that the Japanese live in such small homes. Why do they live? Is it a shortage of space or what's the reason?
Real estate prices. It's real estate prices. It's just very, very expensive. So, I mean, if you go into the countryside, you will find huge houses that are just lying abandoned, and you can, in fact, move into them for free. Like there are village governments which are offering anybody who will move to the villages homes for free, which say somewhere like big homes, right? But nobody wants to live there because it's like Tokyo and Kyoto and Osaka are like these 3 giant vacuum cleaners, which are just sucking up the entire population of the country. And you have this vast depopulated parts of the country where you could live in bigger houses. But because everybody wants to go to these 3 cities, there's not enough real estate. It's as simple as that.
Great. Saida, quick question from you before Sharath asks the last question. Yeah.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, Saida, I can.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much, Pallavi, for taking your time to come here today. I am particularly concerned about the mental health issues. So how aware are they that there is a huge problem, and are they like willing to change? or
very
is
low
there any
awareness.
discussions?
Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry. I'm just quickly answering because I really need to run. But very
Yes.
low awareness and very difficult to change because Japan is a very conservative society. So when you have conservative societies, the path to change is much slower than a society that is more flexible, right? Like China, which has had these huge upheavals and has kind of taken so many U-turns in the last 100 years that I'm amazed it doesn't have whiplash. But you know, karoshi is this word in Japanese which means death by overwork. It's one of the only languages in the world that actually has a special word for that. It means dropping dead at your desk. And you know, so mental health is a huge thing, and but it's rarely spoken about. People don't admit much to personal suffering, and like I said, there's this whole idea of the community or the office or the being sort of above you in terms of importance. So you know, your needs are always subservient to the needs of either your workplace or your family. Your obligations are more than your rights, and whenever you have a situation where obligations are elevated to that extent, obviously there is a mental health attachment, and that vocabulary is still not very prevalent in Japan. The vocabulary of mental health and of sort of, you know, me time and things like that, you would never
Yeah.
hear about that. In fact, they had a whole attempt to make people leave office early on Fridays because of karoshi, because karoshi was becoming such a problem with people dying on their desks that the government said that offices should shut early on Fridays and send people back at 5 o'clock. And it completely failed because nobody would leave, even though they were entitled to leave and they should leave according to the law. But it was just so ingrained in them that there was something gravely wrong about doing this that it just failed just out of social inertia.
Great.
So the last
Sharat,
question, and then I have to
last
run.
question. Yeah.
Pallavi, I know you got to run. On a lighter note, I was quite fascinated to read about Rajnikant, the Rajnikant fan club,
Yes.
Tokyo. And I was just curious, what happened after that? I mean, Bollywood has grown well beyond.
No, so there's not much.
Indian movie industry has gone well beyond
Yeah.
Rajnikant.
But at least while I was there, they didn't watch any. There were no Hindi movies that were getting like public release in Japan. Unlike China, which has a lot of Amir Khan movies, and you know, it's like hugely popular. But in Japan, no. There was this Rajnikant thing, and it really has its roots in the 1990s, and it's a very specialized niche, you know. So this group, Japan is the place of specialized niches. You'll always find somebody in Japan who's the world expert on some kind of niche, you know, whether it's tango dancing or Rajnikant or whatever. So you've got this dedicated following of Rajnikant fans, but they don't actually release his movies in commercial cinema, and there has not been a huge kind of Bollywood uptake, unlike in China.
So it's an Pallavi,
anyway, Pallavi, I think you've been very gracious in giving us so much of your time, and I don't want you and your brother to keep waiting.
Yeah.
So
I think arrived. I can hear all the noise outside. So I will leave you, but thank you for having invited me again. And I would love to maybe hear the Pico Iyer recording later. If all of this will be available on the website, I'll be sure to visit it. And in the meantime, a big thank you to everybody. Thank you for attending.
Thank you to you, Pallavi.
Thank you.
Arigato gozaimasu.
Bye-bye.
Thank you again, Pallavi.
You know, Milind, I have a question on this. You see, in India and in many countries, this thing about staying late, working late hours and all, it changed a lot after COVID. You know, in fact, now most people don't stay beyond 5 o'clock, and many people still don't come to office, right? So I wonder whether that. So I'm not too sure whether it affected Japan that way, because the work culture in India has changed totally.
Yeah, if you don't mind, Arvind, we'll take the discussion at the end because I want to make sure we listen to Pico and then if Rajiv wants to say anything. So go ahead. Abdul, you are going to introduce Pico very briefly and then let's listen to him. Abdul,
yes, brevity has never been my strength, but I'll try my best to be brief today. So most of you, I assume, are familiar with Pico Iyer based upon the web link that Milind sent. He burst into the literary scene somewhere in the 80s with a book called Video Nights in Kathmandu. The title sort of fascinated me, and his name was even more intriguing. And that's how I got interested in him. He's an extremely prolific writer who writes in multiple genres. He has written travelogues, he has written novels, he has written short stories. He's a columnist for various kinds of newspapers. He has written spiritual reflections. He has written biographical work. So the man is very, very proficient in multiple dimensions of literary writing. He is truly a global person who reflects the exuberance of global cosmopolitanism and at the same time, the rootlessness of an amorphous identity. In the sense that here is a person who was born to Indian parents, childhood in England, adulthood in the US, now living in a remote part of Japan, a mix of religiously born as a Hindu. He spends a lot of time in Benedictine monasteries. He travels with Dalai Lama and as a practicing Buddhist. He has also written a fascinating book on Sufi mysticism called Abandon. So the man is extremely eclectic in his view of the world. In his own website divides his life into two parts. One is called Inner Journeys and the other is called the Outer Journeys. And he tries to balance between the inner and outer journeys. For a person who has written so many travelogues to various remote parts of the world, one of his recent books is called The Art of Stillness, Adventures in Going Nowhere. Okay, so his journey is inward, journey is outward. He speaks a lot. At the same time, he also writes about silence. Lastly, I was so touched by his approachability and humility. For this session, I wrote to him saying whether he could participate or whether he could provide a video, etc. He was in the middle of travel because his latest book was being released. So initially he said he may not be able to do it. 1 or 2 days later, he wrote to me saying, sure, I will send a video for you. And then he ran into some problems because his computer broke down, etc. But still he persisted and eventually sent us a video, which Srinivas subsequently improved and edited. So we have a fascinating video to watch. I wish he could have been present, but given that Pallavi lives in Spain and he lives in Japan, finding a common time was very difficult. Just one quote from him from one of his articles. Taking planes seems as natural to me as picking up the phone or going to school. I fold up myself and carry it around as if it were an overnight bag. That in a nutshell tells his view of himself.
Thank you, Abdul. That was a very rich and rewarding profile of this talented author. So with that, Srinivas, can we listen to Pico?
Good morning or good afternoon. I'm Pico, and needless to say, I was so really touched when I heard that anybody from the Indian Institute of Management in Calcutta would have any interest in listening to me on any subject under the sun. And I'm really honored if you're interested in discussing my ancient book, The Lady and the Monk, in your book club this April. I've got to confess that 37 years after I wrote it, much of me cringes when I think of that book. I was barely out of my 30s when I wrote it. I think I was extremely immature, judgmental, know-it-all, unfair, and writing it and responding to Japan much too quickly. But the other half of me is really grateful that I did record my discovery of a country, a person, and a lifestyle that I hope will be mine forever. I stumbled into Japan, as you read, and stumbled into everything more or less backwards. But I'm so glad now that I do have empirical evidence of everything that passed then, based on my fairly compendious notes I took then and there at the time. Because otherwise I might have forgotten it, and otherwise I might not believe that some of it had actually happened. some of you will likely know that just as I was completing the book, my family home in the hills of California burnt to the ground, and I lost everything in the world, including my next 3 books, which were all in handwritten notes. And essentially, I would say I lost many of my boyhood dreams of being a writer, because they all went up in flames. My next 8 years of writing were destroyed. But by good fortune, the working manuscript of The Lady and the Monk was in my shoulder bag when I fled the burning house, and was, of course, a very good guide to impermanence. And the very night our house burnt down, I wrote an article for Time magazine where I was a columnist in those long ago days, and was able to quote from a Japanese poem that I'd picked up while living in Kyoto from Masahide in the 17th century, saying, "My house burnt down, I can now see better the rising moon." Soon after the book came out, people didn't know exactly what to make of it. And because I made a rookie mistake of giving fictional names to real people, many people assumed it was fiction and that I and my wife-to-be didn't exist. But we do, and although it was often placed in the fiction section of a bookshop, it's very much non-fiction, and I really tried to stay close to every detail of what really happened in that year between late September 1987 and December 1988. Quite a few people wanted to make a movie of it, and we foresaw the possibility of Denzel Washington romancing Anna Sawai or some such. But happily, I think that didn't happen. And although it's an old book, and to me a very, very young book, it does seem to have struck a chord with some readers. And in pre-internet days, whenever I was traveling around, and talking about Tibet or globalism or the Cuban Revolution or Islamic mysticism or other things that I've written about, almost always at the end of a talk a hand would go up and somebody would say, "Please, can you tell us what happened to Sachiko? What happened to the woman at the end of The Lady and the Monk?" And I always had to explain that in real life I was a little less clueless than the character Pico that I present on the pages, and of course never left Japan and never left Sachiko. And now I'm sitting in the tiny room in our 2-room apartment that we have shared for 32 years. When I left New York City and my Midtown 25th floor office and my apartment on Park Avenue to live in a single room in the back streets of Kyoto, I didn't understand what a monastery in Japan really was like. And as you read, I had to work through my many romances and didn't last in the monastery long. But all these 37 and a half years later, I know that the intuition that brought me here wasn't wrong. And really, my wife and I, once known as Sachiko, but in real life Hiroko, lead a pretty monastic life. I've never used a cell phone. We don't have a car here. We only have 2 rooms, although it used to be population 4, with me sleeping on a couch next to the TV, not to my stepchildren's delight. The place is so cramped we can't even open the bathroom door fully. And to this day our rent is just $500 a month, so we essentially live a simple life, almost as students. And it feels like the most luxurious life imaginable. So whatever I was seeking when I came to Japan, I found, albeit in unexpected ways. And left to my own devices, I would never leave Japan. Any of you who've been here knows that it's a place of kindness, selflessness, and calm to a rare degree. And I feel very spoilt to be here, even though I choose for most of these 37 years to live here on a tourist visa. So I've never been a grown-up in Japan, but I'm an endlessly pampered and fascinated visitor and foreigner and tourist here. So having written a record of my first year in Japan, and of course the excitement of falling in love with a person and a city and a culture that I had never known before, I thought I should write a sequel of sorts called Autumn Light about my 31st year in Japan. And all of you, I'm sure, know from your own lives, it's relatively easy to fall in love. And the challenge in life is to stay in love and to make a marriage as exciting as a honeymoon, and to make a lifelong relationship as fulfilling as the stages of infatuation might be with a person, but also with a way of being and with a culture. And so I saw the Autumn Light book as very much a sequel to the springtime romance of the lady and the monk, and equally about finding a sense of contentment amidst a sense of surprise. Most of you will probably know that Japan is very much based around the seasons. And every autumn, when the skies blaze cloudlessly blue and the parks turn into this festival of golds and scarlets and oranges as the leaves change, most of my neighbors will put on their Sunday best and head out into the temple gardens and parks, much as people in the West traditionally would have gone to church. In other words, to be joined in a congregation, to be reminded of forces much larger than they are, and to be instructed in the laws of changelessness and change. And of course, one of the beauties of autumn is that it has graces that spring might envy. I don't think life goes downhill between the ages of 30 and 60, say. And autumn has the advantage over spring that it knows that spring will end, but also it knows that spring will come again. And of course, as autumn leads the way into winter, it's leading towards the first day of spring. Soon after I arrived in Japan, I heard this probably Buddhist maxim that life is about joyful participation in a world of sorrows. And so I'm afraid such is my technical expertise that I have to continue now with an audio recording. And it's a feat that you can tell that I live without a cell phone and in simple conditions, because I can't even manage a short video to you. But what I was in the middle of saying was that I love the fact that these brilliant days of autumn, which are the brightest and most cloudless of the year, speak for the coming of the cold and dark, and speak for the necessity of sustaining within ourselves that sense of joyfulness and impermanence in the same breath. And when I wrote that book, Autumn Light, I was keenly aware that books need all the help they can get. They were sat at the center of the culture when I began writing in the 1980s, and now they seem very marginal. So I came up with this crazy and rather mischievous idea of writing an absolutely contradictory book at the same time to come out from the same publisher in the same year. And I rather craftily called it a beginner's guide to Japan, knowing that the poor innocent reader might imagine that this was a book written for beginners. And if he or she didn't open the first page, she wouldn't know that actually it's a book written by beginners, and it's probably no use at all to anybody coming to Japan. Because honestly, I feel I don't know a thing about this country, and I certainly know far less than I suspected I knew when I came here 37 years ago. And I should say, by way of correction, at the beginning of my video, I said I was barely out of my 30s when I wrote The Lady and the Monk. Of course, I was barely out of my 20s. I was tremendously immature and undeveloped there, and basically just a clueless kid, so clueless that I assumed I knew it all. At this point, I feel I do know my wife and my kids because I've been with them for 37 and a half years. I do know this neighborhood because I've been here 32 years, and I do know my ping pong club and its members because I've been playing regularly with them for 21 years, but I don't feel I know much about Japan as a whole. And so I thought the best way I could try to approach Japan was to bring out two books almost as brother and sister. And one, of course, Autumn Light, is a narrative trying to offer an insider's perspective from somebody who lives tightly within a family a community and a neighborhood. And the other, the beginner's guide, is really a series of tweets or koans or micro essays of the kind that might be concocted by somebody who had just arrived in Tokyo last night. And I'm sure all of you know that if you were to write about India or your hometown or your mother, you might well want to mix the internal and the external perspective, because of course an insider sits on knowledge that no outsider can never catch, but at the same time an outsider can see things that no local ever can. And so I thought with this twinned books I would try to speak to the two sides of my life in Japan. One, the forever outsider who lives on a tourist visa here, and the other, somebody who's really made his home and feels that this is my deepest home for reasons I can never explain. So I hope you enjoy some or all of the 3 books I've written on Japan. I really appreciate your giving any time at all to them and bearing with this extremely clumsy, haphazard video-audio presentation. And most of all, I very much hope you will come to Japan. You will not be disappointed. And I suspect you will find a level of thoughtfulness, kindness, grace, and zaniness beyond any you have seen elsewhere. It's really like another planet. So thank you for your attention, and thank you for supporting all of us who write books and who love to read them.
I should say thank you, Pico, because he might be looking at the recording subsequently, but I really felt like I was visiting Japan with him as he spoke. And like Abdul said, he is such a humble gentleman to take the time to send this rich recording to all of us. So we don't have the time to ask him questions, of course, but I'm sure he would welcome them later by email, which we can share with you. So let's move on. Srinivas. Rajiv said he couldn't speak today, but if Yuriko wants to say anything about Japan, Yuriko-san, you want to take a minute to say anything about Japan?
I thought I saw Rajiv. He was on the there. He's there.
Rajiv is there. Rajiv, would you like to speak something? How is your...
I think he's muted maybe.
Yeah, Yuriko-san?
They are muted and they are off the video. So
yeah. So
they're just recording it or something.
Should we move on?
Yeah. So anyway, so let's continue because I think yeah.
Okay. Srinivas, let's move on then. Okay, so my thoughts before we go to the open session, very briefly. So I was thinking what's culture, and harakiri or ikebana came to mind. Disembowelment in the face of abject humiliation, or rejuvenating beauty of flowers expressing art. Luis Alvarez started writing his first grown-up letter to his little boy, 4 years old, while uncertain whether he would ever see his wife, his little boy, and the boy's little sister again, while he was up in the air in the observation aircraft. Looking down at the ground below, it did not look anything like a bustling city of 300,000 innocent civilians. He thought they completely missed the target after seeing blinding flashlight coming off the plane in front of them and the sudden burst from below that lifted their plane up without any action by the pilot. An enormous cloud of heat and light had risen from the ground below. Actually, the little boy sent down from the plane in front had done his deadly deed. That's what explained how an entire city with its people had disappeared from the face of Earth just few minutes ago. This harakiri by the city of innocent civilians was a hefty price paid for an event and its aftermath during the World War. Several thousand miles away, less than 4 years ago, where the Pacific Ocean met with American soil in the middle of nowhere. Today, this city is a vibrant, thriving metropolis that has risen from the ashes of the atomic bombing, serving as a symbol of peace and resilience with a population of over 1 million people. Here's a deeper look at Hiroshima today. As a city of resilience and peace, it has focused on rebuilding and promoting peace and understanding. The Peace Memorial Park, located near Ground Zero of the atomic bombing, is a poignant reminder of the tragedy and a place for reflection and remembrance. The city has infrastructure restored with shopping malls and a vibrant culture. Mazda's coming out from its auto plants, driven the world over. In this very city, you can experience Ikebana through flower arrangement workshops, exhibitions, and cultural events, with opportunities for both beginners and veterans in cultural exchange today. Rejuvenating beauty of flowers expresses art, and life seems serene again, just 80 years later. Can the people and their culture not explain how destruction is replaced with peace and resilience? And I'll let you read a little about Luis Alvarez quickly in a minute of silence. Okay. So with that, let's go to the last segment of our session. Any discussion, thoughts about our special session today? Any comments, questions? Go ahead.
If I may add just a comment, since many of the people may not have read Lady and the Monk. It's an account of his 1 year's life in Kyoto. He just gets up on a plane, goes to Kyoto with no plan, no idea where he's going to stay, what he's going to do. He spends a year living there, and he documents his entire life during that 1 year, where he meets his then-to-be wife, and she's the lady, he's the monk, because he was living most of the time in a monastery. And it is one of the most beautiful books about a relationship that I have ever read. And I would greatly recommend for those who have not read it to try out one of his earliest books, Lady and the Monk.
Great. Thank you, Abdul. I have